For 10 years, Magdalena Rodriguez lived as a mute seamstress in Silver Creek, her silence protecting her from the man who claimed ownership over her very soul. But when a mysterious cowboy arrived with knowing eyes and spoke to her as if he could hear the voice she'd buried, everything she'd built began to unravel, because some secrets are too dangerous to keep and others too precious to lose. What happens when the one person who sees through your deception might be the only one who can save you from it? Smoke curled up from the broken wagon wheel like the devil's own breath in the Nevada Territory heat. Magdalena Rodriguez crouched behind a massive boulder, watching 3 men argue over who would ride to Silver Creek for help, while their companion groaned in pain from beneath the overturned supply cart. This was trouble she couldn't fix with needle and thread. The year 1869 had brought nothing but drought and danger to the high desert, and now strangers were camped barely a mile from town with enough weapons to start their own war. Maggie pressed herself deeper into the shadow of the red rock, grateful for the silence she'd worn like armor for 10 long years. The men below couldn't know she was there, couldn't know she understood every word of their heated discussion about the girl in town who can't talk and how useful she might be. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the tallest man pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. Even from her hiding spot, she could make out the formal script, the kind used by lawyers and debt collectors, the kind that had chased her from the fancy parlors of San Francisco to this forgotten corner of nowhere. They were looking for someone, looking for her. 10 years ago, Magdalena Esperanza Rodriguez had been the daughter of a wealthy merchant, sought after by every fortune hunter on the California coast. Her father's shipping business had made them rich, but his gambling had made them desperate. When Vicente Rodriguez died choking on his own pride and whiskey, he'd left behind debts that legally transferred to his only child, like some kind of curse passed down through generations. Victor Castellanos had come calling the very day after the funeral, his pale hands already reaching for what he considered his property. The marriage contract was drawn up in careful legal language, but what it meant was simple: marry him, or watch everyone she loved lose their homes to pay her father's gambling debts. So she'd run. The desert had nearly killed her that first week. She'd stumbled into Silver Creek more dead than alive, her voice lost to fever and fear. When she'd recovered enough to understand the kindly doctor's questions, she'd simply pointed to her throat and shaken her head. The lie had grown easier with practice. Mute girls were safe girls. Mute girls couldn't tell secrets or cause trouble. Mute girls could hide in plain sight, while bounty hunters searched for missing heiresses who spoke perfect Spanish and English, who could read Latin and play piano, who had distinctive laughs that carried across ballrooms. But these men weren't bounty hunters. They were something worse. The boss wants her brought back alive, the scarred one was saying as he kicked dirt over their small fire. Says she's got information about her daddy's business partners that certain folks in San Francisco would pay handsomely to keep quiet. Information? Maggie's mind raced through memories of her father's study, of late-night meetings with men whose faces she'd been told to forget, of conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered rooms. What had Vicente Rodriguez been involved in, beyond simple merchant trading? The sound of hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls, growing closer. Maggie flattened herself against the sun-warmed stone and held her breath as a lone rider approached the camp below. The newcomer's horse was lathered with sweat, and dust covered both mount and rider like they'd been traveling hard for days. "Any word from town?" the tall man called out. "Found her," the rider replied, his voice carrying clearly in the thin air. "Seamstress named Maggie, who don't talk, lives above Peterson's dress shop on Main Street. Been there near 10 years, just like the boss figured." "She alone?" "Mostly. Keeps to herself. Does mending for folks. Real quiet type." The rider paused to water his horse from a canvas bag. "But there's something else. New man in town. Been asking questions about her. Horsebreaker named Daniel Hart. Folks say he's taken a shine to our girl." Maggie's stomach dropped like a stone. into dark water. Daniel Hart. She'd noticed him around town these past few weeks. The way his gray eyes seemed to see too much. The way conversations died when he entered rooms. She'd thought he was just another drifter. But now, Hart's a problem, the scarred man said, spitting into the dust. Man's got a reputation. Used to ride with some rough company before he went respectable. Won't be respectable much longer if he gets in our way. The casual violence in those words sent ice through Maggie's veins. She'd spent 10 years keeping her head down, avoiding attention, staying invisible. But invisibility only worked if nobody was specifically looking for you. And now they were coming for her, and an innocent man might die, simply because he'd shown her kindness. Thunder rolled across the desert, promising the kind of storm that could wash away roads and trap travelers for days. Maggie began to back away from her hiding spot, her mind already working on how to warn the town without revealing who she really was. But as she turned, her boot knocked loose, a small cascade of pebbles that clattered down the rock face like tiny warning bells. The talking below stopped. What was that? Maggie froze, every muscle in her body turning to stone as heavy footsteps began climbing toward her hiding place. The silver cross at her throat felt hot against her skin, and she found herself praying to saints she'd stopped believing in years ago. If they caught her here, if they discovered she could hear and understand every word they'd spoken, probably just a rabbit, one man called from below. But the footsteps kept coming, closer, closer. A rough hand grabbed her shoulder and spun her around. Maggie found herself staring into cold blue eyes, set in a face marked by old knife scars. The man's grip tightened as recognition dawned across his features. Well, well, look what we have here. But instead of the fear she expected to feel, something else rose up in Magdalena's chest. Something that had been growing stronger every day since Daniel Hart had looked at her like she mattered. She met the scarred man's gaze steadily, her dark eyes holding secrets he couldn't begin to guess. Let him think he'd caught a helpless, mute girl. Let him underestimate what 10 years of survival had taught her about patience, about waiting for the right moment to strike back. The storm was coming, and Magdalena Rodriguez was done running. Careful there, miss. That horse has a mean streak wider than the Colorado River. Daniel Hart's warning came too late. The black stallion's teeth snapped shut just inches from Maggie's outstretched hand, as she tried to retrieve the sewing basket that had tumbled from her arms when the animal spooked. She stumbled backward, her heart racing not from the near miss, but from the realization that the man speaking knew exactly how close she'd come to losing fingers. Most folks would have shouted or rushed forward. This stranger simply stood there, studying her with the same careful attention he'd given the wild horse before approaching its stall. Silver Creek's Main Street buzzed with the usual afternoon activity, but Maggie felt suddenly exposed under his steady gray gaze. She'd been coming to Murphy's livery stable for 3 years now, bringing meals to old Pete, who minded the horses when his arthritis wasn't too bad. The routine was safe, predictable, invisible. Nothing about Daniel Hart felt predictable. He moved like water around dangerous things, she noticed. When the stallion pinned back its ears and rolled white eyes, Daniel shifted his weight without seeming to move at all. When Mrs. Henderson's boy came tearing through the stable chasing a runaway chicken, Daniel simply stepped aside and let chaos flow around him like he was a rock in a swift stream. "This your work?" He picked up her scattered sewing, examining the delicate embroidery she'd been adding to little Annie Morrison's Sunday dress. His hands were gentle with the fabric, respectful of the hours of careful labor it represented. Maggie nodded, reaching for the dress, but he held it a moment longer than necessary. "Take steady hands to do work this fine. Steady mind, too." His voice carried no pity, no false kindness that people usually used when talking to her. Just statement of fact. Mind like that notices things, remembers them. The way he said it sent warning bells clanging in her head. She snatched the dress from his hands and clutched it against her chest like a shield, her dark eyes wide with sudden fear. But Daniel simply tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her standing in the dusty stable with questions she couldn't ask and answers she was afraid to hear. That evening, as purple shadows stretched across the desert floor, Maggie sat in her tiny room above Peterson's dress shop and tried to convince herself that the encounter meant nothing. Drifters came through Silver Creek all the time. Cowboys, prospectors, merchants heading west with dreams bigger than their purses. They stayed a few days, spent their money, and moved on toward whatever frontier called to them next. But this one was different. Through her window, she could see him working with a string of Mustangs in the corral behind Murphy's barn. Even in the fading light, she could make out his silhouette moving among the horses with fluid grace. He didn't break them so much as convince them, talking in low tones she couldn't quite hear but somehow understood. Her father had owned horses once, back when they'd lived in the big house overlooking San Francisco Bay. Racing horses with bloodlines longer than most families' histories. Animals that cost more than working people made in a year. Vicente Rodriguez had loved those horses more than he'd loved his business. Maybe more than he'd loved his daughter. But these weren't pampered racing stock. These were wild Mustangs, caught running free in the desert canyons, their spirits unbroken despite the ropes and fences that now held them. Watching Daniel work with them, Maggie felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought was long dead. What would it feel like to run free again? The thought came unbidden, dangerous as a rattlesnake in tall grass. She'd made her choice 10 years ago when she'd climbed out of her bedroom window in the middle of the night, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and her mother's silver cross. She'd chosen safety over freedom, invisibility over truth. But watching the Mustangs in the corral below, seeing how they tested their boundaries while still accepting Daniel's gentle guidance, Maggie began to wonder if those were the only choices available. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, its voice wild and lonesome against the desert wind. Without thinking, Maggie opened her mouth and almost answered with a sound of her own. Almost. She caught herself just in time, pressing her lips together until they went white with pressure. But for just a moment, she'd felt the urge to add her voice to the night sounds, to be part of the world instead of just watching it from behind glass windows and careful silences. Down in the corral, Daniel looked up toward her window as if he'd heard something. Their eyes met across the dusty space between them, and Maggie felt exposed in ways that had nothing to do with lamplight or shadow. He raised one hand in a small salute, not quite a wave, more like acknowledgement, between equals. She stepped back from the window quickly, her pulse hammering in her throat, but not before she'd raised her own hand in response. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Daniel's patient face, heard the certainty in his voice when he'd said her mind noticed things, remembered them. What exactly had he seen that gave him such confidence about her abilities? And more importantly, what else might he see if he kept looking? The wind picked up outside, rattling her window and carrying the scent of distant rain. Somewhere a door banged repeatedly against its frame, keeping rhythm with her restless thoughts. Maggie pulled her thin blanket up to her chin and tried to ignore the growing certainty that her carefully constructed world was about to change, whether she wanted it to or not. Because men like Daniel Hart didn't just drift into small towns by accident. They came looking for something, or someone. The wild horse screamed as it crashed into the corral fence, its eyes white with terror and rage. Daniel stepped back slowly, his hands raised in surrender, blood running down his torn sleeve where the Mustang's hooves had caught him. Every muscle in the animal's body spoke of violence barely contained, yet somehow Daniel's voice remained steady as creek water. "Easy now, girl. Nobody's gonna hurt you here." Maggie dropped the laundry basket she'd been carrying, her careful silence forgotten as she watched the drama unfold in Murphy's corral. This wasn't the gentle horsebreaking she'd observed before. This was something desperate and dangerous. The mare had been brought in that morning by a group of rough men who claimed she'd killed her previous owner, and now she fought like her life depended on it. 3 weeks had passed since Daniel's knowing words by the hitching post, and Maggie had spent every day wondering when he would corner her, when he would demand answers she couldn't give without destroying everything she'd built. Instead, he'd simply taken work at the livery stable and begun the slow process of earning the town's trust. She watched him now, marveling at his patience, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The mare charged again, her hooves striking sparks from the hard-packed earth. Daniel rolled sideways, avoiding the attack by inches, and Maggie found herself gripping the fence rails so tightly her knuckles went white. Without thinking, she opened her mouth to shout a warning, then caught herself just as Murphy's son Tommy came running from the barn. "Pa says to shoot her," Tommy called out, his young voice cracking with excitement. "Says she's too dangerous to break." No, Daniel's refusal was quiet, but absolute. "She's not dangerous. She's scared." Something in his tone made Maggie's chest tighten with recognition. The way he looked at the wild mare was exactly how he'd been looking at her, not with pity or desire to control, but with understanding, as if he saw past the violence to the fear that drove it. Mayor Garrett appeared at her elbow, his weathered face creased with concern. "Fool's gonna get himself killed," he muttered. "That horse ain't right in the head." But Maggie couldn't take her eyes off Daniel as he approached the trembling animal, speaking in low tones that seemed to reach something deep inside the mare's frightened mind. She'd seen men break horses before seeing them use ropes and force, and sometimes cruel discipline to bend wild spirits to human will. This was different. This was conversation. "Some things can't be forced," Daniel said, his words carrying clearly across the corral. "Sometimes you gotta wait for trust to come natural-like." The mare's ears flickered forward, her stance shifting from attack to wary attention. Maggie realized she was holding her breath. That evening, as purple shadows stretched long across the desert, Maggie found herself walking toward the livery stable without quite knowing why. Her feet seemed to carry her of their own accord, drawn by something stronger than curiosity. The mare stood quietly in her stall now, no longer fighting the rails that contained her, and Daniel sat on an overturned bucket nearby, simply keeping her company. She just needed someone to see past the fight to what was underneath, he said without turning around, somehow knowing Maggie was there. Amazing what a creature can become when it feels safe. Maggie's throat felt tight. She wanted to speak, wanted to tell him that she understood exactly what he meant, but the words stuck like cotton in her mouth. 10 years of silence weren't easily broken, even when every instinct screamed that this man might be different from all the others. Instead, she picked up a brush from the nearby shelf and held it out to him. Their fingers touched as he accepted it, the contact brief but electric, and she saw something shift in his gray eyes. Not triumph or satisfaction, but something infinitely gentler hope. "Tomorrow I'll try brushing her coat," he said. "Might take weeks before she lets me, but sometimes the waiting's the most important part." As Maggie walked back to her small room above the dress shop, she wondered if he was still talking about the horse. Behind her, she could hear him speaking softly to the mare, his voice a steady murmur that somehow made the whole desert feel less lonely. The next morning brought news that would change everything. Mrs. Henderson burst into the dress shop just after dawn, her face flushed with excitement and something darker fear. "Maggie, dear," she panted, clutching at the doorframe for support. "There's been a man asking questions, stranger in expensive clothes, offering money for information about a woman who might be living here under a false name." The world tilted sideways. Maggie's carefully constructed life suddenly felt as fragile as spider silk in a hurricane wind. She'd always known this day might come, but knowing and being ready were entirely different things. What kind of questions? The words escaped before Maggie could stop them, her voice barely above a whisper but clear as mountain water. Mrs. Henderson's eyes went wide as dinner plates. "Child, you can speak?" The secret hung between them like smoke, impossible to take back once released into the air. Maggie felt panic rising in her throat, threatening to choke off the voice she'd finally found. Everything was unraveling. 10 years of careful deception coming apart in a single careless moment. But instead of shock or betrayal, Mrs. Henderson's weathered face softened with understanding. "Oh, honey, what have you been running from?" Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, and Maggie realized the storm she'd been dreading for a decade was finally about to break over Silver Creek. The stranger asking questions could only be one person, and his arrival meant her time of hiding was over. Whether she was ready or not, Magdalena Rodriguez was about to face her past. Daniel found her an hour later, sitting beside the creek that gave the town its name, her hands shaking as she tried to mend a torn seam that didn't really need fixing. The needle kept slipping through her nervous fingers, creating crooked stitches that she immediately pulled out and tried again. "Mrs. Henderson told me," he said simply, settling beside her on the sun-warmed rocks. Maggie waited for questions, for demands, for the inevitable disappointment that came when people realized she'd been lying to them for years. Instead, Daniel picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the water's surface, counting the ripples that spread outward in perfect circles. "My real name's Daniel Christopher Hart," he said conversationally. "Used to be a Texas Ranger, until I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. Been riding under different names for 3 years now, staying one step ahead of men who'd rather see me dead than testify in court." The confession hung between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Maggie set down her sewing and looked at this man who'd somehow managed to see straight through to her heart without demanding anything in return. "Magdalena Esperanza Rodriguez," she whispered, "daughter of a gambling man and a woman who died too young, claimed as payment for debts I never owed by a man who thinks women are property to be collected. Victor Castellanos?" Her head snapped up in surprise. "You know him?" Daniel's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd known him, she saw real anger flash in his gray eyes. "Know of him. Been tracking him across 3 territories. He's got a taste for young women in difficult circumstances, and a habit of making those circumstances worse when they don't cooperate." The pieces clicked together in Maggie's mind, like tumblers in a lock. "You didn't come here by accident." "No," he admitted. "Been following his trail for months, but I came looking for a criminal, and instead I found—" "What?" Daniel turned to face her fully, his expression serious but gentle. "Someone worth protecting. Someone worth staying for." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of hoofbeats echoed across the desert, growing steadily closer. Maggie's hands went cold as she recognized the rhythm too steady to be a casual traveler, too purposeful to be anything but pursuit. Her 10 years of borrowed time were over, but for the first time since that terrifying night in San Francisco, Magdalena Rodriguez wasn't alone. And that, she was beginning to understand, made all the difference in the world. "He's coming tonight." The words dropped from Tommy Murphy's lips like stones into still water, each one sending ripples of dread through Maggie's carefully ordered world. She looked up from the torn shirt she was mending, her needle frozen halfway through a stitch. Tommy stood in the doorway of the dress shop, his young face pale beneath a coating of trail dust, having ridden hard from the next town over where he'd been visiting his cousin. "Saw him at the hotel in Pine Ridge," Tommy continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, as if the walls themselves might carry tales. "Man in a black suit, asking the desk clerk about Silver Creek. Specifically about a young woman who might be living here under a different name." The shirt slipped from Maggie's numb fingers. 10 years of running, of building a new life, stitch by careful stitch, and it all came down to this moment. A boy's frightened words in a dusty dress shop as evening shadows crept across the floor. Victor Castellanos had found her at last. Her mind raced through possibilities like a trapped animal seeking escape. She could run again, disappear into the vastness of the territories as she had before, but the thought of leaving Silver Creek felt like tearing away a piece of her soul. These people had become her family, their trust and protection more precious than gold. The idea of vanishing in the night, leaving only questions and worry behind, made her stomach twist with shame. "Does anyone else know?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Tommy shook his head. "Came straight here soon as I heard. Figured you'd want time to decide what to do." Time. The one thing she'd never had enough of. Always running one step ahead of consequences that seemed to stretch endlessly behind her like shadows at sunset. But maybe this time could be different. Maybe this time she wouldn't have to face the darkness alone. "Find Daniel," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. Tell him it's time for truth." As Tommy raced off into the gathering dusk, Maggie pressed her back against the wall of her small shop and allowed herself one moment of pure terror. Castellanos wasn't just a creditor seeking payment. He was a spider who'd spent a decade weaving a web across 3 territories, patient as death and twice as certain. She'd heard whispers over the years, stories that traveled the gambling circuits about women who'd crossed him and simply disappeared. The sound of hoofbeats on hard earth jolted her back to the present. Through the window, she could see Daniel approaching at a steady lope, his horse's sides heaving from a hard ride. He swung down from the saddle with fluid grace and strode into the shop, his gray eyes immediately finding hers. "How long do we have?" he asked without preamble. "Hours. Maybe less." Maggie's voice cracked on the words. "Tommy saw him in Pine Ridge. He'll arrive tonight, tomorrow morning at the latest." Daniel nodded grimly and moved to the window, his trained eyes scanning the street for signs of watchers. "Any idea how he tracked you here?" Maggie shook her head, then stopped as a terrible thought occurred to her. The stage driver. Last month there was a new man, someone I'd never seen before. He asked Mrs. Court. Henderson, about the local seamstress, said his wife in Sacramento was looking for someone skilled with delicate work. Description: thin man with nervous hands. Kept watching me when he thought I wasn't looking. The memory made her skin crawl. She'd been so careful for so long, but one moment of carelessness, one stranger asking innocent-seeming questions, and her entire world was about to come crashing down. Daniel's jaw tightened. Sounds like a Pinkerton man. Castellanos has been using them to track women across the territories. Professional hunters who know how to ask the right questions without raising suspicion. The casual way he spoke about such things sent ice through Maggie's veins. "How do you know so much about his methods?" "Because I've been hunting him for 18 months, Daniel said quietly. "Ever since my sister Elena became his 3rd wife in Colorado Territory." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Elena Hart? Elena Hart Castellanos, according to the marriage certificate. Found dead 3 weeks after the wedding, supposedly from a fall down the stairs. Daniel's voice remained level, but his hands had curled into fists. Convenient. How clumsy his wives become when they start asking questions about his business practices. Maggie sank onto her stool, the full horror of her situation crystallizing like ice in her chest. She'd always suspected Castellanos was dangerous, but this was murder, dressed up in legal documents and respectable mourning clothes. "She tried to run too," Daniel continued. "Got as far as Denver before he tracked her down. Convinced the local sheriff she was suffering from female hysteria, needed to be returned to her loving husband's care for her own protection." "The law won't help," Maggie whispered, understanding flooding through her like poison. "They never believe women over men like him. Not the territorial law, anyway. But there are other kinds of justice." Something in his tone made her look up sharply. Daniel had moved away from the window and was checking the action on a well-maintained Colt revolver, his movements efficient and deadly serious. "What are you planning?" "Depends on him. If he comes peaceful, willing to discuss terms, maybe we can convince him you're not worth the trouble. But if he comes expecting to drag you away," Daniel holstered the gun with practiced ease. "Well, some men only understand one kind of conversation." Maggie stood abruptly, her whole body rejecting the image of violence erupting in her quiet town. "You can't just shoot him. There'll be questions, investigations. They'll hang you for murder." Not if it's self-defense. And not if the whole town witnesses him threatening an innocent woman. Daniel's smile was grim, but determined. Amazing how many people can see the same thing when it comes to protecting their own. The implications of his words slowly sank in. You want to make this public. Force him to show his true nature in front of witnesses. Men like Castellanos depend on working in shadows, using legal threats and social pressure to get what they want. Drag them into broad daylight, make them explain their actions to decent folks, and they start looking less like respectable businessmen and more like the vultures they really are. A knock at the door interrupted their planning. Mrs. Henderson peered inside, her face grave with worry. Maggie, dear, there's been another stranger asking questions. Chinese fellow this time. Very polite, very careful with his words, but he's been talking to everyone who knows you, asking about your habits, your history. Daniel cursed under his breath. He's not taking chances this time. Multiple angles of approach. Professional trackers. Probably legal documentation that'll make him look like the injured party when he shows up tomorrow. What do we do? Maggie's voice sounded small in the growing darkness. We get ready for war, Daniel said simply. But first, you need to decide something important. What? Are you ready to stop running? Because once we face him down, there's no going back to the quiet life you've been living. Your voice, your story, your choice to speak or stay silent, it all becomes public knowledge. Maggie looked around the small shop that had been her sanctuary for so long. At the dresses hanging on their hooks, the careful stitches that represented years of patient work, the life she'd built one quiet day at a time. Then she thought of Elena Hart, of the other women who'd tried to escape Castellanos' web and failed. I'm tired of being afraid, she said finally, and I'm tired of letting him win. Outside, the wind was picking up, carrying the scent of distant rain, and something else change, inevitable as sunrise, approaching whether she was ready or not. Tomorrow would bring reckonings and revelations, violence and vindication, but tonight she still had choices to make. The most important choice of all was whether to face her demons alone or trust the silent cowboy who seemed to understand that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was stand their ground and fight. As if reading her thoughts, Daniel turned toward the door. I'll be at the stable if you need anything. And Maggie? She looked up at the sound of her name on his lips. Whatever happens tomorrow, you don't face it alone. That's a promise. After he left, Maggie sat in the gathering darkness and did something she hadn't done in 10 years. She prayed aloud, her voice growing stronger with each whispered word, preparing for the battle that would determine not just her future, but the fate of every woman Castellanos had marked as his prey. The hunter had become the hunted, but this time, his quarry would have teeth. The stagecoach wheels scraped to a halt outside Murphy's saloon, throwing up clouds of red dust that caught the harsh noon sun like tiny mirrors. Victor Castellanos stepped down from the coach with the careful movements of a spider testing its web, his black suit somehow still crisp despite the long journey from San Francisco. His pale eyes swept across Silver Creek's dusty Main Street like a buyer examining cattle at market. Maggie's breath caught in her throat as she watched from behind the faded curtains of her small window. 10 years had changed him little. The same cold smile, the same way of standing that suggested the whole world owed him something. But now, she could see what her 18-year-old self had missed. The cruel calculation behind his gentleman's manners, the way his fingers drummed against his walking stick like he was already counting money. Where might I find the young woman called Maggie? His voice carried across the street with the smooth authority of expensive education. I have urgent family business to discuss. Mayor Garrett stepped forward, his weathered face creasing with suspicion. Might be I could help you with that, mister. What kind of family business brings a San Francisco gentleman all the way to Silver Creek? Castellanos reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope sealed with red wax. The kind that involves legal contracts and inherited debts. The kind that brings runaway daughters home to their responsibilities. The words hit the gathered crowd like stones thrown into still water. Conversations died mid-sentence. Children stopped their games. Even the horses seemed to prick their ears forward, sensing something important happening in the human world around them. From her hiding place, Maggie watched Mrs. Henderson's face change, from curiosity to understanding, to something fierce and protective. The older woman had been one of Maggie's first customers, bringing her torn aprons to mend when nobody else would trust the strange mute girl with their good clothes. Now she stood with her arms crossed, looking like she'd fight off wolves to protect what was hers. "That girl's been nothing but good to this town," Mrs. Henderson declared, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd birthed half the children in Silver Creek and buried their grandparents. "Whatever family business you think you have can wait until she decides she wants to hear it." Castellanos smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "I'm afraid the law doesn't concern itself with what young ladies want to hear, madam. It concerns itself with legal obligations and binding contracts." That's when Daniel appeared from the shadows beside the livery stable, moving with the quiet grace of someone who'd learned to walk softly around dangerous animals. His gray eyes fixed on Castellanos with the steady intensity of a hunter sighting prey. "Funny thing about contracts," Daniel said, his voice carrying easily across the suddenly silent street. "They're only binding when both parties enter them freely. Last I checked, selling your daughter to pay gambling debts wasn't exactly what most folks would call free choice." Castellanos turned toward the voice, and Maggie saw his face change as he took in Daniel's tall frame, the worn gun belt, the easy confidence that came from years of handling trouble. "And you are?" "Daniel Hart. I work horses mostly. Break the ones that think they can't be broken, gentle the ones that have been hurt too bad to trust." His gray eyes never left Castellanos' face. Interesting how some lessons apply to more than just animals. The tension stretched between them like a rope pulled tight, and everyone watching seemed to hold their breath. Maggie knew this moment balanced on a knife's edge. Whatever happened next would change everything for better or worse. Castellanos straightened his expensive jacket and smiled his cold smile. "Mr. Hart, I appreciate your concern for local livestock, but this is a legal matter between myself and my intended bride. Perhaps you should return to your horses and leave civilized discussion to civilized men." "Civilized?" Daniel repeated the word like he was tasting something bitter. "That what you call forcing women into marriage through forged documents?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Castellanos' face went white, then red, then white again. His pale hands clenched around his walking stick until his knuckles showed through the skin. "You have no proof of any such thing." "Don't I?" Daniel reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper, yellow with age, but still readable. Elena Vasquez's marriage contract, dated 1865. Signed by a man who'd been dead for 2 months when this paper was drawn up. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard whispers about Elena, the Mexican girl who'd disappeared one winter night and never been seen again. But she'd never connected those stories to the man who now stood in her adopted town, claiming ownership over her life. Elena fought back. Daniel continued, his voice steady as mountain stone. So did Maria Santos. Both ended up in unmarked graves when they wouldn't play along with your business arrangements. Mayor Garrett stepped forward, his face grim. "That's mighty serious accusations, Mr. Hart. You got anything more than old papers to back them up?" Daniel nodded toward the stagecoach driver, who'd been listening with growing unease. "Ask Charlie there about the passenger he picked up in 1866. Young Mexican woman, scared out of her mind, begging for help. Charlie remembers because Mr. Castellanos here paid him extra to forget he ever saw her." All eyes turned to Charlie Brennan, a grizzled man who'd been driving stagecoaches since before most of Silver Creek existed. His weathered face worked like he was chewing something sour. "Didn't want to get involved in rich folks' business," Charlie muttered, not meeting anyone's eyes. "But that girl, she was terrified. Kept saying someone was trying to kill her. Next week I heard she'd been found dead by the river." The crowd's murmur rose like angry bees. Castellanos looked around at the hostile faces and seemed to realize for the first time that his money and legal papers might not be enough to get him what he wanted. "These are wild accusations from desperate people," he said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. "I demand to speak with Miss Rodriguez immediately. My legal rights." "Your legal rights don't mean much when they're built on murder," Mayor Garrett interrupted. "Charlie, ride out to Fort Carson. Wire the territorial marshal and tell him we need a lawman here soon as possible." As Charlie hurried toward his horse, Castellanos's carefully constructed mask finally slipped completely. The gentleman disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating and very, very dangerous. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his pale eyes scanning the crowd until they found Maggie's window. "Legal processes can be delayed. Accidents happen in frontier towns. People disappear." Daniel moved then, faster than seemed possible for such a large man. In 3 quick steps, he closed the distance between himself and Castellanos, not touching, but standing close enough that the threat was unmistakable. "You know what's interesting about Silver Creek?" Daniel said conversationally. "We take care of our own here, and anybody who threatens our people tends to find the desert a mighty unfriendly place." Castellanos stared up at him for a long moment, then turned on his heel and stalked back toward the stage stop. But Maggie could see the calculation in his movements, the way he studied the buildings and the people like a general planning a siege. The battle was far from over. "I know you're listening, Magdalena." Castellanos's voice drifted up from the street below like smoke from a funeral pyre, reaching through her window with fingers of ice. "We can do this the easy way, or we can do this the hard way. But make no mistake, you will be coming home with me." Maggie pressed herself against the wall beside her window, heart hammering so loud she was sure the whole town could hear it. 3 days had passed since Castellanos arrived. 3 days of him walking Silver Creek's dusty streets like he already owned them. He'd been busy. She'd seen him talking to the banker, the judge, even the preacher. Money had a way of opening doors that should have stayed locked. Mrs. Patterson knocked softly on her door. "Maggie, honey? That man's asking for you again downstairs. Says he won't leave until you at least hear what he has to say." Through the thin walls, Maggie could hear other voices, townspeople gathering in the boarding house parlor below. She caught fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. Legal documents seemed to be in order. Father did sign the contract. Not really our business to interfere with family matters. The support she'd felt just days ago was cracking like dried mud in summer heat. Castellanos was good at what he did. He knew exactly which doubts to plant, which fears to water until they grew into acceptance of his claims. Footsteps on the stairs, heavy boots that didn't belong to Mrs. Patterson. "Time to stop hiding, my dear." Castellanos' voice was right outside her door now, smooth as oil on water. "I've been very patient, but patience has limits." The door handle turned. Maggie backed toward her small window, calculating the distance to the ground below. 2 stories. She might break a leg, but she'd survive. Better than whatever Castellanos had planned for their reunion. The door opened, just as another voice cut through the tension like a blade through silk. "Take your hand off that door." Daniel filled the narrow hallway like controlled thunder, his gray eyes fixed on Castellanos, with the steady intensity of a man who'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do it again. Castellanos stepped back, but his smile never wavered. "Ah, Mr. Hart. Still playing protector to damaged goods?" "Last warning." Daniel's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Walk away." "I'm afraid I can't do that." Castellanos reached inside his jacket, moving slowly to show he meant no immediate threat. "You see, I've done some research on you as well. Daniel Hart, wanted for cattle theft in Arizona territory. There's quite a price on your head." The paper he withdrew was official looking, bearing territorial seals and the kind of legal language that could get a man hanged. But Daniel barely glanced at it. "Interesting forgery," he said calmly. "Almost as good as the ones you used to trap those other women." "Prove it's a forgery." "Don't have to." Daniel smiled, and the expression was sharp as broken glass. Already sent word to the Arizona territorial capital. Amazing how quickly telegraph messages travel when you know the right people to ask. Something flickered in Castellanos's pale eyes. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. You're bluffing. Am I? Daniel reached into his own pocket and withdrew a yellow telegram paper. Message came back this morning. Seems the real Daniel Hart died in a mine collapse 3 years back. Convenient identity for a man who needed to disappear, wouldn't you say? Maggie watched the exchange with growing fascination. These two men were circling each other like wolves, each one trying to find the other's weakness. But underneath their careful words, she sensed something else. Daniel wasn't just protecting her out of kindness. There was something personal in his hatred of Castellanos, something deeper than simple justice. Who are you really? Castellanos demanded. Someone who's been hunting you for a very long time. Daniel's voice carried the patient satisfaction of a man who'd finally cornered his prey. Someone who made promises to a dying girl about bringing her killer to justice. The hallway went dead quiet. Even the sounds from the street below seemed to fade away, leaving only the whisper of wind through the old building's gaps and the rapid beating of Maggie's heart. Elena was my wife. The words hit like thunder after lightning, making everything that came before suddenly make sense. The careful way Daniel watched over her, the patient protection, the burning need for justice that had brought him across 3 territories tracking a killer. Castellanos stepped backward, his face going white. Elena Vasquez died in an accident. Elena Hart died fighting for her life. Daniel moved forward with predatory grace. The bruises on her arms told a different story than the one you paid the sheriff to write down. You can't prove anything. Don't need to prove what happened to Elena. Just need to prove what you're planning to do to Maggie. Daniel pulled another paper from his vest, this one covered with neat handwriting. Interesting reading. The letters you've been sending back to San Francisco, especially the ones to your business partners, about securing the asset and ensuring cooperation through appropriate measures. Maggie saw Castellanos' careful control finally crack. His pale hands shook as he realized his private correspondence had somehow fallen into enemy hands. How did you? Charlie Brennan's been intercepting your mail for 3 days. Daniel's smile held no warmth. Turns out, he's been carrying guilt about Elena for years. Amazing how cooperative a man gets when you give him a chance to make things right. The sound of boots on the stairs below interrupted whatever Castellanos might have said next. Mayor Garrett appeared at the top of the steps, followed by half the town council and 3 men Maggie didn't recognize. Territorial marshals, judging by their badges and grim expressions. Mr. Victor Castellanos? The lead marshal's voice carried the authority of federal law. You're under arrest for fraud, extortion, and suspicion of murder in the deaths of 7 women across 3 territories. As the marshals moved forward with practiced efficiency, Castellanos made one last, desperate play. His hand shot toward the small derringer hidden in his jacket, but Daniel was already moving. Years of handling dangerous horses had given him reflexes faster than thought. The gun went off, the sound deafening in the narrow space. But Castellanos was already falling, Daniel's fist having connected with surgical precision. In the sudden silence that followed, Maggie realized she was free, not just from Castellanos, but from the fear that had shaped 10 years of her life. She was free to speak, to choose, to build whatever future she could imagine. For the first time since she was 18 years old, tomorrow belonged entirely to her. The church bell rang 12 times, each clang echoing through Silver Creek, like a countdown to something terrible. Maggie pressed her face against her window and watched 3 riders approach through the desert heat. Castellanos had returned with help, 2 men wearing badges that glinted like threats in the afternoon sun. "Miss Rodriguez," the voice boomed from the street below. "You're coming with us, willing or not." The townspeople gathered in doorways, their faces tight with worry. Mayor Garrett stepped into the street, his hand resting on his gun belt. "Now hold on there, Marshal." That girl's been part of this town for 10 years. You can't just— I got papers from the territorial court, the marshal interrupted, pulling a document from his coat. Says she owes a debt. Says she belongs to Mr. Castellanos here until that debt gets paid. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She'd been foolish to think legal papers and distance could protect her forever. The law was written by men like Castellanos, for men like Castellanos. But then Daniel appeared beside the marshal's horse, calm as still water. Mind if I take a look at those papers? Who are you to question the law? Castellanos demanded from his seat in the covered wagon. Someone who can read, Daniel replied simply, studying the documents. His finger traced over the signatures, the dates, the official seals. Then his face changed, not with anger, but with something closer to amusement. Well now, he said slowly, this is interesting. These papers are dated 1868, but they're signed by Judge Morrison of the Denver court. He looked up at the marshal with raised eyebrows. Judge Morrison died of fever in 1867. I was at his funeral. The marshal's confidence wavered. That don't matter none. Papers look official. Forged papers usually do, Daniel continued conversationally. Just like the wanted posters I've got back at my room. Seems Mr. Castellanos has been busy with his pen and ink, creating all sorts of legal documents that don't quite exist. Maggie watched from above as the truth spread through the crowd like wildfire. Whispers turned to angry mutters. The baker stepped forward, then the blacksmith, then Mrs. Henderson from the boarding house. One by one, the people who'd known her as simply Maggie formed a wall between her and the men who'd come to take her. Even if the papers were real, old Pete Morrison called out, which they ain't. This girl's been supporting herself honest for 10 years. That makes any debt paid in my book. Castellanos' face turned red as desert stone. You simple-minded fools don't understand the law. We understand right from wrong, Mayor Garrett interrupted. And taking a woman against her will is wrong, no matter what fancy papers you wave around. The marshal looked from his forged documents to the angry faces surrounding him. In the territories, law came from the people more often than it came from courts hundreds of miles away. And these people had made their choice clear. I think you boys better move along, the marshal said finally, handing the papers back to Castellanos. Before these folks decide to make their feelings known in ways that might leave marks. Maggie watched Castellanos' wagon disappear into the desert, taking with it the fear that had ruled her life for 10 long years. But victory felt strange on her tongue. She'd spent so long being afraid that freedom seemed almost too large to hold. That evening, as twilight painted the sky purple and gold, Maggie found herself walking through town with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. Her feet carried her past Murphy's barn, past the general store where she'd bought supplies in careful silence, past the church where she'd sat in the back pew every Sunday without singing along to the hymns. The whole town seemed different now. Not because anything had changed about the buildings or the streets, but because she was seeing it through new eyes, not as a place to hide, but as a place to live. She stopped at Martha's Bakery, where the smell of fresh bread had always been a comfort. The older woman looked up from her counter, flour dusting her gray hair like snow. Maggie? Martha's voice held wonder. Is it true what they're saying? That you can talk? Yes, ma'am. The words felt foreign, but right on Maggie's tongue. I'm sorry for the deception. I hope you can understand. Understand? Martha laughed, coming around the counter to embrace her. Child, half the women in this territory would do the same if they had your courage. You don't owe nobody an apology for protecting yourself. Similar conversations followed throughout the evening. The blacksmith's wife invited her for coffee. Young Tommy Henderson peppered her with questions about what her voice sounded like in her head during all those quiet years. Even gruff Pete Morrison admitted he'd suspected something, though his twinkling eyes suggested he was stretching the truth. But it was Dr. Patterson who gave her the most unexpected gift. The town's aging physician pulled her aside as the evening wound down. I've been thinking about what you might want to do now, he said kindly. I could use an assistant. Someone with steady hands and a sharp mind. The territory needs more healers, and I won't be around forever to tend the sick. The offer stunned her. For 10 years, she'd thought only of surviving day by day. The idea of a future, of learning something new, of using her mind for more than just staying invisible, felt like stepping into bright sunlight after years in shadow. I don't know anything about doctoring, she said honestly. But you know about pain, Doctor, Patterson replied. About healing, about patience, about keeping secrets when folks need their privacy respected. Those are the most important skills any healer can have. As she walked home that night, Maggie felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 18 years old. Excitement about tomorrow. Not fear of what might come, not careful planning to avoid danger, but genuine curiosity about what her life might become. Daniel was waiting on her small porch when she arrived, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands. "How did it feel?" he asked simply. "Strange," she admitted, sitting beside him on the worn wooden steps. "Like putting on clothes that almost fit but not quite. I keep waiting for someone to tell me I'm not allowed." "You're allowed," Daniel said firmly. "Not because anyone gave you permission, but because you're a free woman who can choose her own path." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and the sound no longer seemed lonely to Maggie's ears. It sounded like family, like belonging, like creatures who'd found their place in the vast wilderness and weren't afraid to let the world know they existed. "Daniel?" she said softly. "Tomorrow, will you help me learn to read medical books? Dr. Patterson thinks I might make a good healer." His smile was warm as desert sunrise. "I'd be honored to help you with anything you want to learn." For the first time in 10 years, Magdalena Rodriguez went to sleep thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday. The silence that had saved her was finally ready to transform into something even more powerful. The courage to speak her own truth and build the life she'd always deserved. "Will you take Daniel Hart to be your husband?" Pastor Williams asked, his voice carrying across the packed church. The question hung in the desert air like morning mist. Every person in Silver Creek had crammed into the small building to witness something nobody thought they'd ever see. Magdalena Rodriguez speaking her own wedding promises. The woman they'd known as the silent seamstress stood in a simple white dress she'd sewn herself, her dark hair crowned with wildflowers picked that morning from the creek bed. "I will," she said clearly, and the words rang like church bells through the hushed space. Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The blacksmith's wife elbowed her husband when his sniffles grew too loud. Even gruff old Pete Morrison had to clear his throat several times during the ceremony. They'd all played a part in protecting their quiet Maggie, and now they were witnessing her transformation into something stronger. Not because she'd found her voice, but because she'd found the courage to use it. The months between Castellanos' departure and this moment had been filled with small revelations. Maggie discovered she had opinions about everything, from the way the town handled water rights to the best herbs for treating winter cough. Dr. Patterson proved an excellent teacher, and her hands seemed naturally suited to the delicate work of setting bones and mixing medicines. "She's got the touch," the old doctor told anyone who'd listen. "Patients trust her. Animals calm down when she's near. That's not something you can teach. That comes from the heart." But learning to trust her own voice had been the hardest lesson. For months, Maggie found herself starting to gesture instead of speaking, catching herself mid-motion as old habits fought new choices. Daniel proved endlessly patient with her struggles, never finishing her sentences or rushing her through difficult conversations. "Take your time," he'd say when words tangled on her tongue. "I'm not going anywhere." And slowly, carefully, like a flower opening to sunlight, Maggie learned to believe him. Daniel slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, his own voice steady as mountain stone. "With this ring, I promise to stand beside you, not in front of you. To listen when you speak, and respect when you choose silence. To face whatever comes next as partners, not as owner and owned. The promises were their own, written together during long evenings by the creek where they'd learned to trust each other with pieces of their broken pasts. Traditional vows felt too small for what they'd found together. Two people who'd been running from different demons, learning to stop and build something real. After the ceremony, the whole town gathered behind Murphy's barn for dancing and celebrating. Fiddle music floated across the desert, while couples spun under strings of lanterns that swayed in the evening breeze. Maggie found herself pulled into conversation after conversation, townspeople eager to hear the voice they'd wondered about for so long. "Always knew you were smart as a whip," laughed Martha from the bakery. "The way you'd organize my orders without saying a word. Pure genius." "Never fooled me for a minute," claimed Pete Morrison, though everyone knew he was lying through his tobacco-stained teeth. Could see the thinking going on behind those eyes. But it was young Tommy Henderson who asked the question that mattered most. "Miss Maggie, Mrs. Hart, were you scared this whole time? 10 whole years?" Maggie knelt down to the 8-year-old's level, considering how to answer honestly without frightening him. "Sometimes being scared is smart, Tommy. It keeps you safe when danger is real. But sometimes being scared becomes a habit, even when the danger is gone." "How do you know the difference?" Daniel appeared beside them, 2 cups of punch in his hands. "You test it," he said simply, "little bit at a time, with people you trust. Like learning to ride a horse, you don't jump on the wildest Mustang first day. You start gentle and work your way up." The celebration continued late into the evening, but Maggie found herself stepping away from the crowd several times, still overwhelmed by so much noise and attention after years of careful invisibility. Each time, Daniel appeared at her side without being asked, offering quiet company until she was ready to rejoin the festivities. "Getting married is supposed to be the happy ending," she confessed during one of these quiet moments. "So why do I feel like I'm standing at the edge of a cliff?" "Because you are," Daniel replied honestly. "Marriage is just the beginning. The real work starts tomorrow." "What if I'm not good at it?" "At being a wife, At being visible." Daniel turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious in the lantern light. "Maggie, you've spent 10 years being the person this town needed, mending their clothes, comforting their children, keeping their secrets. You think a wedding ring is going to change who you are at heart?" As the evening wore on, Maggie began to understand what he meant. The celebration wasn't about her transformation from silent to speaking. It was about the community acknowledging what had always been true. She belonged here, had always belonged here, not because of what she could or couldn't say, but because of how she'd chosen to live. Near midnight, when the last dancers had spun their final dance and the cleanup was nearly done, Daniel found her sitting by the creek that gave their town its name. Moonlight turned the water silver, and somewhere in the distance, a nightbird called to its mate. "Regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the smooth rocks. "Only that it took me so long," she replied, surprised by her own honesty. 10 years is a long time to spend being someone else. "But you survived," Daniel pointed out. "That girl, who ran from San Francisco in 1859, she was smart enough to know when to disappear and brave enough to build a new life from scratch. That's not nothing." Maggie considered this, watching the water flow past their feet toward distant mountains. The creek had been here long before Silver Creek existed, would be here long after the town crumbled back to desert dust. There was something comforting about that continuity, that sense of being part of something larger and more permanent than individual fear. "I keep thinking about what happens next," she admitted. "Dr. Patterson wants to teach me surgery. The town council asked if I'd consider running for school board. Mrs. Henderson thinks I should start a women's reading circle." She laughed softly. 10 years of silence, and now everyone wants to hear my opinions. "What do you want?" Daniel asked. It was such a simple question, but Maggie realized nobody had asked it in over a decade. What did she want? Not what was safe, not what was expected, not what would keep her hidden, but what would make her happy. I want to help people heal, she said slowly. I want to learn new things. I want to raise children who never have to pretend to be less than they are. She paused. I want to grow old with someone who sees me clearly and loves me anyway. That sounds like a fine life to me, Daniel said softly. Above them, stars wheeled across the Nevada sky, in patterns that had guided travelers for countless generations. The desert wind carried scents of sage and possibility, while somewhere in the darkness, wild horses ran free across open ground. Tomorrow, Magdalena Hart would wake up beside a man who knew all her secrets and loved her anyway. She would speak when she chose to speak and stay quiet when silence served her better. She would learn to heal bodies, and maybe, in the process, finish healing her own spirit. The frightened girl who'd fled into the wilderness had become a woman who understood the difference between hiding and choosing her battles. And in that small distinction lay all the freedom she'd ever need. As they walked home together, hand in hand through the sleeping town, Maggie realized that her story hadn't ended with finding love or defeating her enemy. It had begun the moment she'd decided to stop running and start building. The rest, the voice, the community, the man beside her, those were just the rewards for finally having the courage to plant roots instead of always preparing to flee. The creek murmured its ancient song, washing clean the last traces of who she used to be, leaving only who she'd chosen to become. And for the first time in 10 years, Magdalena Hart fell asleep without listening for the sound of approaching horses, because she'd finally learned the difference between survival and truly living. 6 months later, as autumn painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Maggie stood before the small congregation in Silver Creek's makeshift church and spoke her wedding vows in a clear, strong voice that carried to every corner of the room. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. Learning to trust her voice again, to believe that her words had value, had taken months of patient encouragement from Daniel and grudging acceptance from a town that had to readjust their understanding of who she really was. Some folks struggled with the change, preferring the simple narrative of the damaged woman they'd protected to the complex reality of the intelligent survivor who'd been hiding among them. But as she looked into Daniel's eyes and promised to face whatever came next together, Maggie understood something profound about the nature of freedom. It wasn't found in running away from the past, but in choosing to define your own future. Her voice had always been there, waiting beneath the silence. She just needed to find the courage to use it. I thought hiding was strength, she whispered to Daniel as they walked down the aisle between smiling faces. But speaking truth, that's real courage. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain and new possibilities. Somewhere in the distance, a wild mustang called to its herd, and the sound spoke of untamed spaces and unlimited horizons. Magdalena Hart squeezed her husband's hand and added her own voice to the desert symphony, no longer afraid of who might hear. In the end, we discover that our greatest prison is often the one we build for ourselves. But within each of us lies the key. We need only find the courage to turn it.